Have you ever wondered why in the story of the fall in Genesis 3, Satan tempted the woman and not the man? I mean, theoretically, it could have been the other way around, right? But it wasn't. And the question is, why not? Why did Satan choose to go after the woman instead of the man? Was that just pure coincidence? Or did he think she would be easier to deceive than the man? Or is there another reason? Let's take a look. Hi, welcome to Masterpiece. My name is Chris, and I believe that in order to answer this question, we need to do something we should always do when we study the Bible, and that is to take a look at the context of this story, which in this case would be Genesis chapter 2. Now, as I've already shown in another video, chapter 2 is actually more than just context. It's really directly connected to chapter 3. In other words, even though there's a chapter division in our Bibles, which by the way was added later and is therefore not part of the original text, so even though in our Bibles it's 2 chapters, it's really one and the same story, which makes it even more important to look at chapter 2 if we want to understand what happens in chapter 3. All right, so what happens in Genesis 2? Well, you remember the Lord God creates man from the dust of the ground. He breathes into his nostrils the breath of life so that man becomes a living being. And then God places him in the garden that he planted in order for man to cultivate and keep it. And one of the things that's in that garden are trees. And in verses 16 and 17 of chapter 2, God tells the man that he may eat of all the trees except for one, which is, of course, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Okay, so that's the first part of the chapter. Now notice what happens next. Right afterwards, in verse 18, God says that it's not good for man to be alone, and that he will make a helper corresponding to him, which is obviously a reference to the woman whom God will create just a few verses later. So at the end of chapter 2, just prior to chapter 3, there's a clear focus on the woman who is created by God as a gift and as a helper because it's not good for man to be alone. And the interesting thing is that both of those things are mentioned right after God's command that man should not eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So why is that significant? Because it suggests that the fact that it's not good for man to be alone and the woman's role as helper are at least in part related to the issue of not eating from the tree. Now, the interesting thing about the Hebrew word translated as helper is that it's not just associated with the idea of assistance and support, but also with the idea of deliverance by a stronger party. In fact, when you look at the other occurrences of this word in the Old Testament, you realize that it's used most frequently in connection with God himself, who is the helper or deliverer of Israel. So when the woman is referred to as a helper, it doesn't mean that she's some sort of lowly assistant to the man, but that she actually has a role that is very similar to God himself. And the fact that she's introduced in that role right after the command not to eat from the tree opens up the possibility that at least part of God's plan in creating the woman was that she would not just save man from his solitude, but also from eating from the tree and falling into sin, in the sense that together they would be stronger and better able to resist temptation. Now, if that's true, the strategy of the devil makes perfect sense. He doesn't tempt the man, he purposefully tempts the woman. The great gift man has just received in order to thwart God's plan and actually reverse it by making the woman a very different kind of helper than God intended. So instead of the woman delivering the man from evil, so to speak, the very opposite occurs. She delivers him into evil by helping him to eat, and as a result, the harmony between them is shattered. Instead of rejoicing over the woman, the man now accuses her. It seems like Satan has succeeded on all levels and completely destroyed God's plan. But the amazing thing is that this is not the end of the story. Satan's strategy seems to have worked perfectly, but now watch how God responds to all this. After Adam and Eve sin, he comes looking for them and he talks to them. And then starting in verse 14 of chapter 3, he talks to the serpent. And what does he say? First, he pronounces a curse on the serpent. And then he says that he will put enmity between the serpent and the woman, and between the seed of the serpent and the seed of the woman, and that the seed of the woman will crush the head of the serpent, while the serpent will crush his heel. So why is that significant? Because it means that the woman, who was an integral part of Satan's strategy to plunge humanity into sin, now becomes an integral part of God's plan to defeat Satan and rescue humanity from sin. Satan led the woman to become a negative kind of helper, but God restores her to her role as a positive helper, which means that even though Satan succeeded for a while, he doesn't have the last word. In the end, God's plan will come to pass, and it will come to pass in an even more amazing way than at the very beginning. And the role of the woman becomes even more significant because through her, the ultimate deliverer, The ultimate helper of mankind will come who will defeat the devil for good. So what do you think? Does that make sense? Anything you want to add? Let me know in the comments. And if you want to learn even more about Genesis 2 and 3 and how these chapters are really one story, then go watch this video next, and I'll see you there.